I'd like to thank everybody involved with this wonderful organisation, this centre, and the Anglo-Turkish Society, because I've been given some terrific help, not least technical support for this, which is, you know, I always say, you know, we can land a washing machine on a comet, but try and get a slide projector to work for an hour consistently is sometimes more problematic. So thank you to everybody who's been helpful in putting this together for me. 3 or 4 years ago, I had the idea of writing a book about the Middle East, but being neither a politician nor a theologian, and it seems to me that that region is just dogged by everything, the conflicts of both those disciplines, I had to find another excuse, another way to satisfy this need. And if I know anything at all, it's probably a little bit about plants and gardens. So why not, I thought, a sweeping history of horticulture throughout the Bible lands, defined for my purposes as being that great tract of land from southeastern Turkey to northern Egypt, from Alexandretta to Alexandria. The epicenter, of course, being the Fertile Crescent in Syria, thousands and thousands of irrigated acres of absolutely prime agricultural land. But thinking, when I was planning this project, that Israel might be the most difficult country for me to navigate on my own, I joined up with a group from the Mediterranean Gardening Society, boarded a plane for Tel Aviv, and motored across to Jerusalem and down to the desert areas around the Dead Sea. A few days later, further north on the Golan Heights, we trod a careful path through fields reputedly still alive with landmines. I mean, they are still there, and you see these awful evidence of recent explosions that are left over, of course, from the Six-Day War. We were in search of a very rare iris called Iris Grant Duffii, which only grows in that one part of on one particular part of the Golan Heights. And we found them too, yellow, short, stubby, and there they were, surrounded by orchids and cyclamen and hellebores and shrapnel. But that was in 2011, and of course while I was there, Syria erupted and really rendered the whole of that project impossible. It's a no-go area, and probably will be, I hope not, but it probably will be for many years to come, and I have to use my energies elsewhere. So I needed another project, one still with a whiff of the Levant, but in less dangerous territory. I then recalled an early morning passage down the Bosphorus in 2008 on a cruise ship where I'd been lecturing on a trip around the Peloponnese and across the Black Sea. We went to Odessa, to Sevastopol, and to Yalta, where, by the way, there were some fascinating gardens. And on our last day, the ship that I was on, a small ship, fortunately, not one of these blocks of flats that you now see anchored in Venice and in Istanbul and everywhere else. But on our last day, the ship headed for Istanbul, and that was our final destination. And pre-dawn, we entered the Bosphorus, coming down from the Black Sea, so we entered in the north. It was chilly, the sun wasn't up, but from the deck, wrapped in scarves and with a greatcoat over my pyjamas, I watched in awe as we inched our way down this historic strait, passing old waterside mansions and tiny villages, swelling in number as we neared Istanbul itself, with yalis, palaces and grand hotels becoming more and more crowded together. Cedars and pines seen through the binoculars suggested a wealth of private or at least screened off gardens. And fired by those lasting images, I returned in 2012 to investigate the likelihood of a book about the gardens in that vast microcosm. For none, in English at any rate, seemed to have been written. I suppose I've been half a dozen times since 2012. I've made friends there, and I think I've learned a little bit about the way the city operates. So what follows really now this evening is a taste of these travels, not so much a description of the gardens. And nor am I really talking so much about the private gardens. I'm sorry to disappoint my thing when I was introduced as being a little bit about private gardens, but not much. I've just been in Istanbul. I came back 2 weeks ago, and I spent a month looking at private gardens, but they are not part of tonight's remit. So the first thing really you have to understand about Istanbul is that it is not a garden city, and the Istanbul are not gardeners. They probably never were, despite inheriting a fabulously rich legacy of Ottoman art and artifacts, where just about everything, from cradle to grave, from a baby's shawl to a centenarian's burial shroud, and beyond to tombstones and memorials, everything was stitched, embroidered, painted, engraved or carved with flowers and leaves. Today's residents of this sprawling metropolis of more than 15 million, twice London's population, live mostly in high-rise apartment buildings. If there's no balcony or roof terrace, individuals must get their horticultural fix from cut flowers, from houseplants, or from a stroll in the regrettably few parks. As a substitute for the real thing, however, they have on their doorsteps public collections studded with a profusion of flower-decorated manuscripts, paintings, jewellery, ceramics, fabrics, ceremonial robes. And nor am I overlooking a glut of ancient battlefield weapons and paraphernalia, where breastplates, helmets, shields, blades, and gun stocks were all similarly embellished. Death in Ottoman times came beautifully decorated. At the city's Naval Museum, newly refurbished and stocked, there's a small fleet of imperial kaiki that once ferried a succession of sultans up and down the Golden Horn, and their richly figured gilded prows have now been beautifully restored. For its relatively small size, no more perhaps than a couple of football pitches, if you'll forgive the annoyingly popular method of comparison to a football pitch, Istanbul's Gezi Park has in the past couple of years attracted more column inches in the world's press than just about any other urban retreat. It stands in the so-called European district of Pera, hard against the north flank of Taksim Square, where massive underground developments have recently consolidated the metro, the majority of bus services, and the funicular railway that links to the tram network in Kabataş. It's handy too for taxis and for the shared minibus like Dolmuş that will run you out to almost any of the city suburbs for a handful of coins. But for a principal city, remember Ankara is the capital, Taksim Square is notoriously unground and is, above ground, the subject still of much speculation, debate, and indeed worry. Its most interesting building is single-storey and blind, that's to say, doorless and without windows. You can just see the back wall of it there. And it's where the flower sellers have their stalls. It's now a municipally run art gallery, built as a Taksim. This is where Taksim Square gets its name from. Taksim was is a distribution point for a supply of fresh water to the city. In this case, an 18th century stone reservoir built by Sultan Mahmud I. It was filled by a continual gravitational flow through a 20-mile network of pipes and aqueducts from Belgrade Forest at the top of the Bosphorus on the Black Sea coast. The square's prominently situated Ataturk Cultural Centre is a sad sight these days, I have to say. Built in the late 1960s, it's very much an architectural statement of its time. This former multi-purpose arts venue, and indeed an opera house, closed its doors in 2008 and is reputedly lying for demolition in an ongoing revamp of the whole area. It now, somewhat shamelessly, presents a scarred exterior to the world, and on state occasions and noted anniversaries, its broken windows and crumbling masonry are partly shrouded by the national flag, sometimes two, and a giant unfurled portrait of Ataturk himself, his unseeing pale eyes seemingly still surveying all before him. He died in 1938, by the way. Although the AKM and its neighbours are vulnerable to the area's future facelift, somewhere near the middle, and sacred, I would imagine, and therefore safe, stands the 1928 Monument of the Republic, surrounded by crescent-shaped flower beds. Safe, perhaps, but anything can remove. Remember, Eros in Piccadilly Circus has been recited twice in its history. The Monument of the Republic is crafted with bronze figures set in brown and cream marble that, to my mind, resembles chocolate and vanilla halva. It was made by one, or designed by one Pietro Canonica, who lived from 1869 to 1959. He was Italian by birth. He was also a sculptor, a painter, an opera composer, a professor of the arts, and an honorary senator in his native land. The monument is a focus of Istanbul's many civic ceremonies and a rallying point for demonstrations and protest marches choreographed to highlight political discontent. Last year, when I was there in November, spanning the anniversary of Ataturk's death, it was the 10th of November, its surrounding flower beds were bedded out with cyclamen in the colours exactly matching the red and white of the Turkish star and crescent flag. Sorry. You will see how the colours work together, I hope. Sorry, there we go. As its sunken central area of grass and flower beds is surrounded by elevated plats, whose slopes could, in another life, have accommodated serried ranks of spectator seating. It was no surprise, therefore, to discover that the inner courtyard of the Orientalist-style Halil Pasha artillery barracks, which stood on that site from 1808 until their demolition in the 1930s, had indeed been converted to a stadium in 1921, where soon after the Turkish national football team played its first official international match. And the Enaraks among you will know, of course, that it was on the 26th of October 1923. The opposing team was Romania, and the result was a 2-2 draw. On the northern part of the original Taksim Square, completed in 1943, there's now a series of international chain hotels situated on the site of an Armenian cemetery that dates back to 1560. What survives are the few precious acres of greensward, 2 fountains, numerous lofty plane trees that shade pedestrian avenues lined with a string of benches. Here, throughout the day, and maybe into the night as well, for there are no gates or railings, men, mostly, snooze, smoke, and solicit, sipping tea dispensed from vacuum flasks by vendors pushing 2-wheel carts up and down the paths. Those plane trees are indisputably fine, and the park's seasonal bedding out is, well, seasonal and bedded out, replicating almost any other municipal scheme. There are rose bushes, but like so many of them in urban parks everywhere, they're straggly affairs, made all the sadder in my view by a stubborn determination to flower non-stop throughout the year. Stray dogs enliven the scene with sporadic territorial disputes, and the high day and night police presence I noticed in 2012 was much relaxed in 2013, the year of the summer riots, when crowds occupied the park to protest against new plans to convert it into yet another shopping mall. Needless to say, you can see now the police, this is standing around the edge of the elevated approach to Gezi Park. Of course, the police returned, and in greater number. Not surprising, really, in a city where guns are very easy to find. This in the shopping mall in a subway right by Galata Bridge. When I was there last month, however, peace was paramount, and everyone was going about their business in a very normal way, and it was absolutely delightful. Understandably, news programs and the international press concentrate very much on this city centre area when there's trouble. But there's more to Istanbul than to Taksim Square. It's one park and a team of controversial redevelopment planners to which a disgruntled section of the population directs its political angst. We must step back, head south from Pera, cross the 2-tier Galata Bridge, go forward into the past, to Constantinople, to Byzantium, to the web of labyrinthine streets within the few remaining land walls, on top of which, until really quite a short time ago, small vegetable gardens were still being tended. The walls were of a double thickness and filled with earth, so people utilised the tops to cultivate fruit and veg. That no longer happens. And on a duck-egg blue morning, the sky appears penciled with minarets and scalloped with leaded domes the colour of London pigeons. For really it is the mosques and the many elegantly cordoned off and seemingly randomly placed ornate tombs of old Istanbul, or rather their immediate environs, congested cemeteries or broad mown plats, where fragments of green remain intact and I think probably quite unthreatened. There's a sort of great protection on those sites. And on languid summer afternoons, yet more plane trees and sycamores, they shelter us all, resident and tourist, believer and infidel, and we're all there jostling for cover. But we must hurry on, like the Arab proverb, man's pleasure is like the noonday halt under the shady tree. It must not, it cannot be prolonged. Occupying the city's most auspicious promontory, where in ancient days stood the Acropolis of Byzantium, with views along the Golden Horn, up the Bosphorus and across the Sea of Marmara to the hills of Asia, stands the squat complex of buildings that comprise the great Seraglio, Topkapi Palace. Visiting in the 1870s, Italian traveller Mondo de Amici said, "There is not another place indeed in the whole of Europe, the name of which alone arouses in the mind so strange a combination of beautiful and terrible images." It was, he added, once a royal palace, a fortress and a sanctuary. Here was the brain of the empire and the heart of Islam, a city within a city, a noble and magnificent stronghold with an entire population of its own, guarded by an army containing within its walls an endless variety of buildings, places of pleasure or of horror, the urban and the rural, palaces, arsenals, schools, offices and mosques, where feasts and massacres, religious rituals and love trysts, diplomatic ceremonies and outbursts of frenzy all took place. And here too, I might add, were sultans born. Here they ascended the throne, here they governed millions of lives and deaths, and here they themselves were deposed, imprisoned, and sometimes murdered. In Topkapi's overall ground plan, added to over the centuries, there were also gardens. But in Amici's day, they had, so to speak, lost their bloom. Better, he said, to see this famous Seraglio as it was in the days of Ottoman greatness, when its vast rectangle was divided into three great courts of different sizes, from which arose a plethora of variously coloured roofs, flower-laden terraces, gilded domes, white minarets, airy pinnacles and monumental arches, interspersed with groves and gardens, all half hidden by foliage. You can wander around these courts today, but your own imagination has to do the colouring in. There's little about them to suggest that erstwhile Ottoman greatness. However, like the face of a now faded theatrical beauty, the bones are there, and I heard recently from a reliable insider that plans are afoot to remake at least one of Topkapi's famous gardens. I found on repeated visits to Istanbul that I retraced certain steps, glad to be reacquainted with familiar potholed pavements that lead to quietish places, although nothing in Istanbul is really quiet, where for a few minutes I can take stock, write up my notes perhaps, plan the next bit of my pedestrian adventure, or simply allow my spirits to be rekindled. One place I go to regularly is the little cemetery garden which houses Bayezid II's 16th century tomb, beside the mosque that also bears his name, with cloisters by the great Ottoman architect Sinan. There too is the tomb of Bayezid's daughter, and that of a prominent 19th century Ottoman diplomat. It's an intimate and restful sanctuary, sweetened by birdsong, an antidote to the ubiquitous mewing of the city's seagulls, and animated on sunny days by the dancing shadows of small trees, hard by the frantic confusion that is the Grand Bazaar. You've all been there, I'm sure. This, reputedly the world's largest covered market, an agglomeration of some 5,000 stalls and shops, concentrated in more than 60 covered passageways and alleys, been variously described to me as retail nirvana or a mayhem of molestation. Take your pick. The outline of the Suleimani Mosque, surely Istanbul's finest, crowns the skyline. It too was built by Mimar Sinan, the mastermind credited with the design of more than 100 other mosques, 57 madrasas, some 17 hospices, 48 hammams, 36 palaces, 8 bridges, and much, much more. Sinan died in 1588. He was aged 99 and still working. Rightly, Suleiman's mosque enjoys a degree of spaciousness unknown to similar buildings and receives far fewer tourists than either Hagia Sophia, now a museum of course, or the Blue Mosque, situated only half a mile away. Suleiman's large green court, the Mosque of Suleiman's large green court, is fringed with magnificent plane trees, and its high plateau-like site on the third of Istanbul's 7 hills, next to Istanbul University, offers a chance of a refreshing breeze on the hottest of days. The architect Sinan, he outlived the eponymous Suleiman the Magnificent. He lasted another 20 years. While gout-afflicted Suleiman himself, the Ottomans' longest reigning sultan, outlived his wife, his beloved but duplicitous Roxelana, by 10 years. But all three are buried in grand mausolea within, or in Sinan's case, just outside the mosque's precincts. In the adjacent crowded cemetery, in a hot, dry soil, irises, they've freely seated themselves amongst all the tombstones. These white marble tombstones, they just absolutely burst with these lovely blue irises. These are only still in bud. Another couple of days and they'd have been open. And you might like to know, by the way, that there's a new novel by Elif Shafak, who's a popular Turkish writer. Her 9th, maybe her 10th novel has just been published, and it's called The Architect's Apprentice, and it's about Sinan. I bought a copy this morning, so I can't tell you any more about it than that, but I look forward to reading it over Christmas. The Suleiman-i Mosque and the university's adjacent tree-filled park are just 2 of my stopping off places when en route to the Alfred Heilbronn Botanic Garden, which lies on the mosque's north side, on a slope poised over the Golden Horn. I go there as often as I can, not just for its spectacular views, its stillness, or its many labelled plants, also for a suite of most beautifully tall, narrow greenhouses filled with uncommon exotics. But I go there because the rumours have suggested, sadly, that its days may be numbered. Here's another view of it. If you're by Galata Bridge or crossing the Golden Horn at all in that part of Istanbul, if you look up as if towards the Suleimani Mosque, it's the one little clump of green that survives in that particular direction. Go and have a look at it, because it really is, I think it's threatened. The head gardener there, he speaks just enough English for us to chat about the plants in his care, but he keeps custody of his tongue, because when I ask him about the garden's continued survival, he says he doesn't know, or perhaps no final decision's been made. But needless to say, however, because of its dramatic and central location, and here's, by the way, is the head gardener, in one of those narrow greenhouses. It's 12 acres, and you can see by the views it has, it is one of the prime sites of Istanbul, and it can just suddenly be, I'm sorry, cut. Not, I hope as violently as that. However, academic botanist Alfred Heilbronn, the garden's founder, was a Jewish refugee from Hitler's Germany. And upon arrival in Istanbul in 1933, he said, "I found myself in front of an institute which had only 3 rooms and was in a decrepit condition. I had to give lectures to about 1,000 students in a very unsuitable building used by the Faculty of Science. The government eventually accepted the impossibility of such a situation and gave me permission to establish a new institute and arrange a botanical garden in place of the small garden with just its 90 plants." That's all it had in this original stage. Work started on the new garden in 1934, and it began operating as a scientific body the following year. Heilbronn contributed his own drawings for the garden, and indeed he designed the 7 greenhouses. striving to give them similar conditions to their advanced counterparts in Europe. Only through personal correspondence with German corporations and old friends he had back in Germany was he later able to buy much of the necessary high-quality equipment needed for serious botanical study. The garden receives very few visitors. On warm and sunny days, I've repeatedly had the place to myself, except perhaps for a scattering of devout souls seeking shade during their lunch break, reading perhaps the Quran in peaceful surroundings, ruffled only by the murmurings of a small fountain. The main inner part of the garden slopes towards the Golden Horn, and the flower beds are delineated by low box hedges, which you can see here, and some stone retaining walls. The whole thing is on a slope like this. There's a small citrus collection tucked away in one of the corners, and among specimen firs, camphor tree, tulip trees, magnolias, paulownias, arbutus, you'll find camellias and such other familiars as hellebores, lily of the valley, peonies. They're all there, lots of salvias as well. And there's a small fenced-off area protecting some brick staging crammed with pots of bulbous plants. Many of them are extremely rare. Now I know, looking at some of the labels, I was allowed to go inside this fence and look at some of the labels. Some of those crocuses particularly are extraordinarily rare, perhaps less than maybe a dozen or 20 known in cultivation. So they're very well looked after. But whilst, of course, the garden has none of the smartness of, say, a Kew or a Wisley, nor, needless to say, of course, their comparable numbers of staff or budgets, it nonetheless possesses an atmosphere that I think at once is fragile and strangely mysterious, and, of course, doomed. Perhaps that mystery comes from knowing that it is, perhaps, its days are numbered. So there's no guidebook to Istanbul gardens in English. I'm still writing it. I've got as far as a good first draft, and I hope to be going back in March to concentrate more on the private gardens to give a much fuller picture. It's a strange place. Istanbul has never offered itself easily. Its abiding essence has always remained hidden from those who do not search for it. Thus wrote Leslie Blanche in her page-turning biography of the exotic, erotic, and indeed neurotic writer Pierre Loti, the assumed name of French naval officer Julien Viau, who lived from 1830 to 1923, who went native in Istanbul for a few months in his mid-20s, and who celebrated lover, the graceful, sinuous, calm, and noiseless, green-eyed Aziyadeh, came to his love nest at Ayub in the night, in the hours of the jinns and the phantoms, wearing an overdress of violet silk strewn with gold roses. The village of Ayub is now a suburb of Istanbul, further up the Golden Horn, and in the 18th century tulip shows were staged along the water's edge, and the Sultan's guests wandered through the gardens and along the marble quays, drinking sherbet, while candle-bearing tortoises clambered among the flower beds. Pilgrim standard bearer. It's said to be the third holiest place in the Islamic world, after Mecca and Jerusalem. And as Jeremy Seal discovered when writing his book, A Fez of the Heart, the summit of Ayub Cemetery Hill, which he paints in dun, wintry colours, is nonetheless no bad place to size up the city's expanse and to plan one's own explorations. Today, you can save yourself the slog of climbing its steep winding paths by taking the teleferique, avoiding too the risk of being mugged in its concealed alleyways. You know, it's a very steep hill, and these are sunken alleyways with high walls, and in broad daylight I'd be very nervous about walking there. So the teleferique takes all that risk away. The twin cable cars, they glide slowly and spectacularly, really, very slowly, majestically, over this sort of forest of pines and cedars and some deciduous trees, some oaks. Of course, Turkey is famous for its oaks. And all these trees are breaking from the multitudinous hillside graves in what is really one of Istanbul's largest cemeteries. Here's a picture from telepherique, from the cable car, looking down, you can see, you get some idea of the way it's tabulated, the way it's terraced, and these seedling trees are just bursting out absolutely everywhere. Cemeteries, it was touched on in the introduction. Muslims, remember, are not cremated, hence a demand for urban burial land that is and always has been intense. And it's a fact that caused Lady Mary Wortley Montagu to observe 300 years ago that the burying fields about Constantinople are certainly much larger than the whole city, adding, "'Tis surprising what a vast deal of land is lost in this way to Turkey." Well, what Lady Mary then considered lost is a game for those of us who can appreciate and mature arboreal skyline of an old Istanbul cemetery. And unlike Jeremy Seale's view from the top of the hill, obscured, he said, by a succession of bridges that bound Istanbul across her legendary waterways, mine, on a very warm November morning last year, was veiled. There was a mist, and it was just veiling Asia, distant Asia, in an unseasonal and alluringly diaphanous heat haze. Gradually, as I sipped coffee and nibbled away at a cake on the terrace of the Pialotti cafe, which is at the top of the cemetery, the mist magically lifted, and like a sort of theatre gauze, really, it exposed the city's far-reaching panorama, and at a glance revealed the thousands of streets that I must tread, I suppose, in search of Istanbul's hidden gardens and green spaces. Despite those far-reaching views, the middle and upper reaches of the Bosphorus remained masked by the hills opposite. So, to savour the Bosphorus fully, you must take to the fast-running water itself by jumping aboard a steamer for the 2-hour boat trip from Memnuna, which sails as far as the Romani Hisari fortifications and the Sultan Mehmet Bridge. That's the second one. There's a third one, by the way, under construction now, right at the beyond right at the top, and I think that's going to be completed in about another 18 months. The first big pylons are already in. The Bosphorus, this 20-mile slender strait, debouches a chilly south-flowing surge from the Black Sea into the more temperate waters of the Sea of Marmara, on through the Dardanelles and eventually to the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, and is of course the continental border between Europe and Asia. And along both Bosphorus shores, among ferry-bustling piers and jetties, new developments that include glitzy nightclubs and low-rise apartment buildings. There are a small number of old palaces and summer consular buildings, among a few enduring slopes of coniferous woodland. That's the Dolmache Palace, they're very close to the centre. And the further north you go, away from the city, the more verdant it becomes. You begin to see more and more trees between the buildings. But only a small number of Ottoman waterfront yalas or summer country residents remained extant. Many of them, as you probably know, were constructed of wood and have succumbed to fire over the years, while others have been destroyed by ships veering off their narrow course by brutish storms and uncertain currents. But even now there stand some venerable cedars along the shore. Amongst these marvellous, you know probably, you all know it probably better than I do, it changes every half mile. You just see one extraordinary sight after another. It's really quite remarkable. Paintings and old books. So here's another one. That's one of my favourites. I think this is quite beautiful. Right under the shadow of one of the bridges. But paintings this is just somebody going home for lunch, which I thought was quite nice. In a lovely little wooded spot. This is on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, north of Üsküdar. And I think it's the remnants of a little nursery or something. The way those trees have been planted suggests to me that this might have been a little plantation that was either used for the selling of trees or for a small amount of timber. Paintings, of course, and books recall plenty of these grand buildings among the villagers scattered along both sides of the Bosphorus. And the fortunes of some of them, however, has fluctuated, grown and then diminished, only to swell again. In the Owl's Watch Song, funny title, but it's one of the more colourful and idiosyncratic books 20th century books about Istanbul by a British writer called John Cudden. And in that he quotes Evliya Efendi, the Turkish chronicler, who at Üsküdar, on the southern Anatolian side of the Bosphorus, in the 17th century listed 11 kitchens for the poor, 47 convents, 800 private baths, 11 caravanserai, 500 inns, khans, 66 water distribution establishments, so there are more taxims, over 2,000 shops, 4,000 vineyards, and 300 gardens with fragrant flowers. Yet, within living memory, this is the view, of course, across from that particular point, within living memory, Üsküdar was also known for its vast, sacred, sinister, ghostly cemeteries, where Cudden himself in the late 1950s noted the graves of many centuries accumulated amidst the forest of cypresses, waterways and streams. Here, he said, death rules in a crumbling empire of desolated stone and rampant undergrowth, while over all, mile after mile, trim, black and motionless, the cypresses stand like funereal plains. Üsküdar is hugely popular once more. There's a bit of the cemetery. This time with a younger generation, of course, who have moved there in their droves, transforming and much enlarging a sleepy waterside community into a chic and vibrant place to live. And of course now linked to the European side by the new tunnel, through which fast and frequent trains ferry passengers to the old city within just a few minutes for just a few lira. The Ottomans, as I'm sure you know, spilt much foreign blood, and their own made quite a few puddles as well, throughout an empire that lasted 6 centuries. But the 12 years, from 1718 to 1730, during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, was a period of relative calm and peace, and became known as the tulip era, when this one flower, the tulip, gained iconic supremacy over a native flora, which is indeed, in any case, one of the richest in the world. And at Emigen Park, a few miles up the Bosphorus, on the European side, the tulip has now found itself a lasting bricks and mortar home in a suite of recently converted Ottoman stables and carriage houses. This state-of-the-art air-conditioned Istanbul Tulip Foundation, I won't give you its Turkish name, now hosts an ongoing programme of principally tulip-related exhibitions and talks. All sorts of things are happening, and it's very, very exciting, and it changes around quite rapidly, which is lovely. And of course the park is, in each April, the focus of the annual citywide Tulip Festival. Some 10,000 tulip bulbs are planted in that one park alone every year. Around 10 million, did I say 10 million? 10 million tulip bulbs are planted in that park every year. Some 10,000 of them comprising the Tulip River, which is, if I describe it as a sort of spirited lava flow of excess, designed to represent the Bosphorus. Here's another tulip exhibit, and here, taken in the summer, with summer flowers, is this representation of the Bosphorus in plants. But in April, that is all planted. That is all manifests itself in tulips. Interestingly, in a conversation with the mayor of Istanbul last year, I was told that new initiatives have been set up right across Turkey to encourage domestic bulb farming, with the dual aim, this is wonderful, I think, of regenerating rural employment, while at the same time reducing the need to import such large numbers of bulbs every year, most of them, of course, from Holland. Emigen's tree-clad slopes comprise one of Istanbul's 2 largest public green spaces. The other is Yildiz Park, with its ornate and colourful banqueting pavilions. Formerly the imperial garden of the Yildiz Palace, a retreat for the ruling family in the final days of the Ottoman Empire, it was for many years before that a royal hunting ground, dating back to the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. Today, the park's blossoming treescape weaves together a lush canopy of magnolias, Magnolia grandiflora, Judas trees, bay, horse chestnuts, and oaks. Again, I think I said earlier that Turkey is, I think there are 18 endemic species of oak in Turkey alone. It's quite amazing. And from their topmost heights, both Ermigem and Yildiz parks grant these spectacular views to and across the Bosphorus to Istanbul's Anatolian hills, partially hidden by the city's far-reaching expanse of new suburbs. More than half the city's residents now live on the Asian side. Excuse me. Now, change of mood. If this is a reminiscence now of something quite different. I remember being told by a Turkish gentleman sipping tea in Taksim Square, in a cafe in Taksim Square, and he said to me, you know, a man can remember a woman with a single flower. So how very much more romantic is it to recall her with a whole garden, more than 120 acres of it. Such is the gesture made by philanthropist Nihat Gökçek in memory of his late wife Nezahat. And here we are together last spring. And you'd be forgiven that this amazing gesture was the act of a bejeweled grandee from the Ottoman Empire's distant and glittering past. But our hero, Nihat Bey, is alive and well as any 88-year-old can be. We met first in his Istanbul office. Far beyond retirement age, he continues to go there. He's chairman of Tekfen Holdings, Turkey's largest firm of civil engineers. Situated beyond those Anatolian hills, but still within the municipality of Istanbul, straddling the intersection of two motorways. And all I have here is a photograph of a photograph which shows Nihat Bey on the right and Adil Gurna, the director of the garden, on the left, who trained at the Edinburgh Botanic Garden, by the way. This shows the nascent quality of this garden when soon after it was being laid out, and you can see the two motorways running east-west and north-south. And it straddles all those intersections and slip roads. And it probably is the most unlikely setting for a botanic or indeed any other sort of garden. The land is leased from the General Roads Directorate and Mr. Gökçek's ANG Foundation. That's something which he set up in 1999 to promote education. This is long after his retirement, to promote education, health, culture, art, and nature conservation throughout Turkey. And Mr. G led me slowly around his creation on my first visit. The ground is poor, it's only motorway spoil, yet supports a diversity of plants in 8 sections. They're known as islands. They're separated one from the other by the motorway slip roads, and they're linked together by tunnels and underpasses. Each is botanically themed. There's a rose garden, there's a garden full of colourful perennials that we'd all recognise. Here's a formal Ottoman garden, or the recreation of a formal Ottoman garden. And another, and remember we're right in the new suburbs, and there you can see force themselves out of the ground just like the trees themselves, these amazing skyscrapers. There's another little garden which always touches my heart when I walk there, because it's named after a Turkish frigate which sunk in 1890 in a storm near Oshima on the Japanese coast. And in this little garden there are 537 cherry trees, each commemorating the 537 lives of the Turkish sailors who were drowned that day, and their names. They each have their own name. It's all been recorded. It's very moving. And my tour usually ends with a stroll through one of these tunnels. The displays change, but this is a photographic exhibition that was on one occasion. But there are fantastic images of left over from the 2010 exhibition when Istanbul was the cultural capital of Europe. And so they've got these amazing collection of beautiful reproductions of Turkish miniatures and ceramics, fabrics, rugs, jewellery, clothing, footwear, glass, furniture, masonry, and of course the weaponry that I mentioned earlier, each, of course, bearing floral or folio motifs. And if you find yourself in Istanbul with half a day to spare, do make for this exceptional and pioneering garden, built against all odds, and which adds, in fact, 12%, these 120 acres, adds 12% to the city's acreage of green space. And it's more than one man's homage to a much-loved wife. It's for the people of Istanbul, and it's for now. Finally, let me focus just for a few moments on the artifacts that I opened with, to that Ottoman legacy so richly emblazoned with floral motifs, and to Iznik and other ceramics where stylized tulips, carnations, hyacinths, they all predominate. They're all there in a highly stylized way. The highly refined and slim-petaled tulip that appears in so many, you'll see it now here, there's these very pointed tulips here, but highly stylized. There's another, there's another. And as far as I can see, and I know there's a tulip expert in the audience because I was talking to her earlier this evening. Diana, where are you? Because Diana's just written the most wonderful book about tulips right through all the stands. Wonderful. It's a great book. This, and you'll correct me please, Diana, if I'm wrong, but this long, slim-petaled tulip, here's a very bad picture of it, taken at one of in somebody else's presentation that I was at the Fifth World Tulip Summit in Istanbul last year. And I think its nearest counterpart in nature is Tulipa acuminata, although some doubt, some botanists doubt whether that's a true species or not. It may well have been a naturally occurring hybrid, that's to say, a cross between two other tulips that had formed this thing. But anyway, it was transformed by artisans into this highly stylized thing that you see absolutely everywhere. And it was known to the Ottomans for several centuries and was introduced to British gardens as a bulb, and you can still buy it. You can see it now in most of the bulb catalogues. It came here, I suppose, in the 1860s, so it's been around for 150 years. And you can buy them. Parker's bulb catalogue, De Jager's catalogue, they all have Tulipa acuminata. Here's some more of those highly stylized tulips. And again, taking center stage, as it were, with carnations, easily identifiable, muscari, and all sorts of little bits and pieces all the way around. This is from the British Museum. The town of Iznik, of course, is just 60 miles from the southeast of Istanbul.